Cé míle fáilte, 100,000 welcomes from Dublin to all of our guests around the world. I'm Robert McGilliff-Fodrick, and I'm founder of Talent Summit and CCO of Sigma Recruitment, part of the group Adequate. Welcome to the second edition of Back to Basecamp Talent Summit series. This session we teed up to look through two lenses. First of all, we want to look at through the humanics lens of leadership. And second to that, we want to look through the mechanics of organizational structure, and really to see how we can organize chaos for new order, and to see how we can unlock a more robust, agile organization as we look to recover. And I'm delighted today to be joined by two of our great friends at Talent Summit, and two people who I would handpick into my war cabinet at a time when it's needed. Delighted to be joined by David Barrett, who's CCO of Aon Assessment Solutions, leading an advisory team across 35 countries. And David's a world expert where talent, technology, and measurement meet. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Robert.
And second of all, I'm joined by Ian McLean. Ian is founder of Flow Group with 20 plus years of leadership and transformation consultancy experience. When Ian and I speak, we tend to speak at one point more than often, and Ian taught me this during the last crisis, that the word for crisis, or the character for crisis at least in Chinese, Ian, means two things: one, crisis, and one, opportunity. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks very much for the intro. I like the 20 plus years of experience. I don't know what the second plus was for, but I take it as it was meant.
I was being kind, Ian. Welcome to the Situation Room.
Thank you.
Ian, I'll start with you. I've been listening to your podcast series, which has been phenomenal, by the way. You've titled it Leadership in Chaos. And the title, I know, was hyper relevant about 2 months back. And do you think we're through the most chaotic period? Do you think it's behind us?
Short answer to that is we have, over the last 8 or 9 weeks, we've been hosting webinars for our clients. And, everybody's trying to figure out how to get through this thing and how to cope with it. And we've got a couple of questions that we ask clients and have done consistently for the last number of weeks. And the first question is, are you experiencing struggle and pain in your organization? Predictably enough, 95% of people are saying yes. And the second question that follows that up is, are you expecting more pain before this is over? And 85% of people are expecting more pain. So if you just ask the audience and you base it on that from our clients, then it seems like we're not through the worst of it. And you mentioned the fact of chaos and the title of the podcast, which is called Leadership in Chaos. Well, to be honest and open, we've been intending to do a podcast for about 5 years, but we were too busy to ever get the time to do a podcast. All of a sudden, you get granted this gift of time. And my gift of time came directly in the early part of March, when I came back from being abroad and opted to put myself into self-isolation. So I had 2 weeks on my own in an apartment outside of the family, thinking about what am I going to do. And I thought to myself, well, if I don't start a podcast now, it's never going to happen. And in thinking about it, the title of Leadership in Chaos is, it's based on the idea of chaos, which was there before the universe was created, actually. So, we're going to have a new universe by the time this is all over, once we sort out the chaos. But I think your original question was, is the chaos over? And there's a kind of common understanding that at a certain point and at a certain phase, that this is going to be over, and we're going to return to the I guess the description of the time is the new normal. And the truth of it is there probably won't be a new normal. We might call it what we want to call it, but there's an expectation that there's going to be normality restored. And the truth is, in the 20 plus years that I've been working with leaders in transformation, everybody expects things to return to normal whenever we're going through change and transformation. But of course, it's just an illusion. It never happens. So we're going to constantly be trying to deal with some form of chaos, albeit the chaos we're currently dealing with is with a large C as opposed to what we typically deal with, which is a small c. And the final thing I'll say about chaos is that it actually comes from, and we link it into the 4 rooms of change, which is the Swedish model. And the chaos room is very characteristic of now, because there are basically 4 or 5 things that define the chaos room and the infrastructure to it. The first is that basically nobody's got any answers. There are lots of opinions in the chaos room, but very, very few answers. The second thing is that it's characterized by confusion. So, trying to understand where we are is quite difficult for everybody. Thirdly, the one thing we do know is that the old world order and all the comforts that were part of that, they're gone. And we're trying to understand, fourthly, what the new world order is going to look like. And that's really what we're trying to figure out. So maybe CrossFit had it right when they said, for leadership, get comfortable with uncomfortable, because this is where we are. And if we accept that that's where we are, there are things that we can be doing as leaders to enable us to move forward out of this. And that's really what we're trying to do through the call and with our clients.
I mean, if we are to get comfortable being uncomfortable, how do we prepare to be at our best as leaders? And what's expected of us and our leadership right now?
There are an awful lot of parallels between this chaos that we're experiencing and the chaos that occurred a decade ago or more during the major financial crisis. And one of the most interesting aspects about that is that we observed, as we were working with clients and trying to navigate it ourselves, one of the biggest characteristic or features of it was that there were winners and losers from a leadership perspective. Some people really emerged with flying colors, and other people ended up with a wooden spoon. And it reminds me of, there was a lot of talk a few weeks ago about the Olympics. And if you go back to the last Olympics, which was in Rio in 2016, one of the characteristics of the last Olympics is that there were more personal bests recorded during the last Olympics than there had been at any previous Olympics. But equally, there were more personal worsts recorded.
Okay.
So the idea is that when you put people under pressure, what ends up happening is some people rise to the occasion and others fall away. And we'll have seen that already. We saw it in the last crisis. It was exactly the same. And we are currently seeing exactly the same thing. Some leaders are emerging and they're really doing a great job. And we can see it either locally or internationally on the political stage and economic stage. And it's like the Warren Buffett quote in a different context. It's only when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming in the nude. So this really is, it is the leadership moment. People's reputations are going to be made or they're going to be broken based on this and how they show up during this particular time. And I was struck by one quote from Laura Marlowe, the war correspondent of the Irish Times. She said, the one thing she's learned about wars is that wars end. And this too will end. So the question really to consider and to think about is, as a leader, given that this is going to be a defining moment in your leadership, how do you want people to be talking about how you showed up and how you performed during this time? There are, to answer the original question, there are 5 basic things to focus on, of the many things. And the first is to be calm. The second is to be clear. The third is to be connected. The fourth is to be your best self and look after and mind yourself through it all. And the fifth is to look for opportunity. So I can talk about those as we go through the rest of the session.
There was one thing I picked up in your podcast series, Ian, when you spoke about intent. And leaders' intention is often and nearly always good to do the right thing for the people to propel the business into a better place.
Yeah.
But the experience of those they lead is really the measure of how their leadership will be assessed or judged in the future.
Yeah. It's true of ourselves as we go through life, because the fact is that as we walk through life and we're judging ourselves, we judge ourselves by our own good intentions because we know what they are. But other people, unfortunately, don't judge us by our intentions. They judge us by our impacts. And this actually was interesting because one of the other questions that we've consistently asked in the last 9 weeks of the lockdown has been, how well are you leading your team? And we asked people to comment on that and rate themselves. The second question that followed that up was, how well are you being led by your leader? There was a 90% satisfaction rating with how well I'm leading my own team and a 55% satisfaction rating with how well I'm being led. And that therein lies the dynamic and the definition of we judge ourselves by our own intentions, but other people are judging us by our impacts. And that 45% performance gap that's in there, if my maths is right, that's what we're playing with here, because that's how you're going to be judged. It's how people receive you and how people experience you, not how you intend to show up.
Well said. Thanks, Ian. David, I'll come to you. We've been through some transformation and some change in the last couple of weeks, and people are speaking very flippantly, including me, about the future of work and about we propelled into the future. And it's much, much more complicated than that. But the one thing that I'm kind of struggling with as we look to wean ourselves off the government subventions and the threads that are hanging us onto the top of the working world as it's being turned upside down, it's inevitable that certain pieces are going to fall to the bottom, but we seem to be suspended somewhere in the middle. How have the tactical steps that we've taken to cut spend on people, how has that impacted or restricted our ability to reform at pace and to use this momentum that we seem to have gained over the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, well, Rob, that I think that it's been a terrible tragedy for so many people on a personal level, and it's impacted people's careers and the economy's damaged. But from an opportunity to learn and see an experiment happen live and at scale about how people and companies respond, it's been amazing. Maybe it's a once in a couple of decades chance to see how people act and operate as corporations and individuals. At the moment, what I've seen, and I'll have to apologize that I won't have as many maybe colorful stories as you, Ian, but just before I start, what you said about the leaders and the people, their followers, is that it reminds me of the 90% of people believing they're above average drivers, which is quite a scary statistic. So I think that fits in with the bit of I think the quote from Napoleon where he wants his generals to be lucky as well as anything else. That it's not really people's fault. Oftentimes they find themselves in a difficult situation. Like if you're working for a company that's delivering telecommunications tools like a Zoom or something like that, or you're working for Halfords that's done amazingly well to get denominated as an essential service in the UK, whose share price quadrupled over a month and just dropped back slightly because they sell bicycles in the UK. You're lucky. That doesn't make you necessarily skilled and a genius. And if you're working in Oasis or Debenhams who've been decimated by this on the high street, it doesn't make you a bad person or the company you work for a bad company. I think I'd like to say that first of all, in that there's a lot of people doing their best. The Napoleon adage about the generals having to be lucky holds true to some degree. However, what I would say, Rob, is that I'm looking at companies from China to California, from New York to New Zealand, about what way they're acting. And all of the good companies have something along the following lines as their modus operandi. They're looking, first of all, to protect people and assets to begin with. So they all operated in a very thoughtful, empathetic way about how to treat people, first and foremost inside their own company, to make it possible to work, make people safe, make people confident that they were being dealt with by safe custodians. At the same time, they look to do the same thing with their clients, to confirm to clients and customers, we're going to try and trade, we'll honor our commitments, we'll serve you. So they looked inwards and outwards very quickly with a high level of empathy. Then they moved very quickly into looking at protecting things around their cash and their balance sheet. So now that's where things get a bit more brutish. You've got people looking at reducing third-party spend. If you're a contractor, you're probably in trouble now. If you're a supplier into an impacted industry, they looked at reducing SIB costs, so anything to do with bonuses, discretionary spend on health and benefits, pension matches. We have now a lot of our clients across the globe, depending on the law, looking at people on part-time working, furloughed, salary reductions, either voluntary or involuntary. And they're then moving at the same time to then make a pivot to see how they can maintain or increase revenue on areas that are viable. And then that's leading into how they look at near-term business strategy. And what I think, Rob, we're seeing is that companies have gone in the space of 6 weeks, in some cases, from kind of being traumatized, and now we're seeing companies go into the action mode about what's our new operating model for the future. And all of the good companies have done something along that spectrum, and they've done it faster than I would have thought a lot of them were capable of doing.
And as we look to make decisions now, as we reconvene, David, do you have any sense of where do we start to plan, to measure, and to look at the workforce and who we decide to reconvene in the workplace? And how do we look to develop this dual model of continued remote and the physical workforce over the coming months?
Yeah, well, I think that what I can see in our human capital work is that we're doing lots of these projects that are called like return to work and new talent for new operating models, and they've got all different kind of strap lines. But what you can see is that companies are running a rule over which cohorts of people within different job families and job groups that do different tasks that are either critical for security, they're critical for operations, they're critical for revenue, they're critical for strategy, or they are not critical for any of the above. And they're rapidly looking to see where they will need to redeploy people and expenditure around the new models that they tend to operate. So we have a lot of clients who might be involved in, we'll say, leisure or tourism or hospitality. They're all looking at like, well, would it be better if we were a company like Peloton as opposed to a company like a David Lloyd's gym, for example? And you've got companies involved in hospitality and tourism looking at how to use their balance sheet and cash reserves maybe to reach into that type of space. You have companies that were big department stores that didn't have a proper online presence. And they're rapidly now, where they've got a strong enough balance sheet, and this is where the cash conservation drive and the balance sheet preservation comes in, they have to live to fight another day. That's the real challenge about like how companies can think long term. It's not that easy to think long term at the same time when you're trying to make sure you've enough, in your piggy bank to be able to reformulate your strategy. We've seen them all look though to try and adopt characteristics of the companies that are faring well. So everybody's looking to how you can deliver things virtually, how you can allow people to work remote, how you can serve customers without physical interaction, how you can adopt your product to maybe still deliver a customer experience. Like what will hairdressers or beauty salons do, or cosmetic companies, ones that depended on concessions, for example, what will they do? So you've got this massive redeployment around people looking at operating models that are customer-centric, technology-led, and often virtualized, and they're looking to probably not maybe take back on staff into certain areas, and to look at using the savings in those places to pay for new types of jobs. Question for us in talent is, will they build that talent? Will they buy that talent? And how quickly will they make their businesses successful again? It's hard to know, but what I will say, Rob, is that we were on a call yesterday with a lot of our financial services clients, and they were trying to explain what they thought companies would do around investment. And there's been more corporate bonds issued in North America in the first 3 months of this year than there was in last year in the first, I think, 8 months. And it's going to be the biggest year ever in terms of corporate debt being raised to fund reinvention. So this isn't government bailouts or money coming from the EU or that kind of soft money that's coming as supports. This is companies seeking to raise debt to get them through the problems, but also to reinvent. So I think that's the way that we're seeing it. Companies are moving fast into what they're going to invest in as service models now, and they're worried, but they're active.
Very good. And it'll come to you now just from a leadership perspective, so back into the humanics, if I may. If we have a need to make decisions, and to make quick decisions quite often for the short term, and if the long term is a series of short terms, how do we use data? And what's the risk of using data on the legitimacy of our decision making, and how that impacts the communication and therefore has the effect that we intended?
I think data in and of itself is as valuable as how you interpret it. So the leadership role is obviously to take the data that's out there, and heaven knows there's enough of it, and try to translate it into something that's meaningful. So how do you, as a leader, communicate that? One of the interesting dynamics, the human perspective on this and the human reality is that we all the time, even before this particular realm of chaos that we're in now, the most common refrain that we hear from people when there's a crisis in an organization that's going through change in any dimension is, where were the leaders when we most needed them? So the most common reaction whenever there's a crisis or there's chaos for leadership is that it disappears, or at least that's the appearance that it gives to those who are following, who are ultimately the arbiters of whether you're leading well or you're not. So this perception, and it's very, very natural, because when we're in chaos and there's uncertainty, what it does is it appeals to our lower order brain, and essentially we go into fight or flight mode. And humans, leaders are as human as the next person, so they're not a different category, and they're subject to the same laws. So therefore, the most natural thing that leaders do is, rather than make the wrong choice or the wrong decision, they often abstain. And they think they're doing the right thing by abstaining and deferring communication, when actually what they're doing is they're sowing the seeds of further chaos amongst people. Because the human side of the follower is that it will naturally assume whenever there's no communication coming, particularly in times of uncertainty, we have a negativity bias, which causes us to escalate up our ladder of inference. So we take the data we're surrounded by, with the absence of nothing in a vacuum from our leaders, and we start to assign meaning to it, and the meaning is the most negative possible outcome. And by the end of it, we're up at the top of this conclusion that we have taken. And now the leaders come out, and they've got twice the work to do to undo the conclusions that people have drawn, which were based on no information, and to try to then reinforce and give the information that but they've actually doubled their workload. So it's done with very good intention, because they don't want to give the wrong information and the wrong. So this is very human, but it's a human dynamic that gets accentuated during chaos, where so much is at stake for people, and the risks are high, and people's limbic systems are active. So they're looking for information, they're drawing their own conclusions, and that's why leaders, more than anything else, need to be connected. And there are two things that leaders typically underestimate, even in peacetime, about themselves as leaders. The first is they underestimate their impact. They think they're just being themselves, whereas in fact, what you represent to people who are following you is far more than just you yourself as a human being, because of your authority, your influence, your connections, your decision-making capability, your access to information, your networks, your experience, etc. So you represent far more, and leaders typically underestimate this. The second thing that they underestimate is the need to communicate. So typically leaders under-communicate. They think that because they've sent the message, that message sent equals message received. So just because we've done the town hall, or we've sent the memo, or we've circulated the strategy, they believe that that's enough and it's done. And all the while, we're picking up the pieces where we're hearing, well, we don't know, we don't understand, it's not enough. So under communication happens in normal times. In abnormal times, you need to be hyper vigilant and over communicate, particularly in this bizarre situation where people are forced to work remotely. And communication is even, the opportunity for miscommunication, misunderstanding, and misrepresentation is exponentially grown when you're remote versus when you're face-to-face with people and you can put an arm around somebody's shoulder.
And it's funny how communication between intention and how it's received, and that broadcasting or that kind of channel of communication, is now quite different. And the necessity of that, as the workforce has been dislocated from the workplace, it's now become the lifeline. It's now become how we collaborate. It's now become how we connect and what happens between us. And so that social capital is how we communicate. So usually what we do, guys, at one stage during each of these Talent Summit events is there'll be a view from the ground. So we're going to bring in Mary Kate. Mary Kate is the director of the People Advisory Service in EY, to get a view of what she's seen across the ground in terms of the transformation. She joined us in 2 seconds. But David, I might just start with you, just to kick this one off. Mary Kate.
Hi guys, how are you?
Hello.
Good, thanks for joining. Actually, David, I won't start with you. I'll go back to Mary Kate. Mary Kate.
What have I been asked in my absence?
Well, good to see you, and I'm glad the tech worked. What are you seeing across all the different organizations that you guys are advising as they're looking to prep to go from this kind of medium term transition to kind of newer ways of working or newer order?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been an interesting journey probably for a lot of organizations that we're working with and who we're engaging with in the market. In EY, we've been talking about framing the response in terms of a now, next, and beyond. So now being that immediate crisis piece, next being the sustainment of that response, and the beyond being that kind of strategic shift piece. So the immediate phase we're through, it's the command centers, it's the crisis management teams, it's the rollout of, exactly, the chaos room, absolutely. And now actually we're seeing clients being more on that sustainment piece. And understanding what they need to do to sustain their businesses, their processes, and their people. And the reality is that there is no playbook for this. We are learning as we go, and the need to continually listen and adapt is ever more present. And as such, there have probably been unintended consequences, both positive and negative. So on the one hand, we've organizations who are absolutely in awe of how remote working has been adopted. They're seeing like levels of collaboration and problem solving and productivity like never before. And on the other hand, actually, they're also acutely aware that their staff are juggling competing priorities and responsibilities and emotions like never before as well. So at the moment, there's this massive focus, and it's no surprise to the people on this call, around health and well-being. And I think probably one thing to think about is, not everybody's going to be infected by COVID-19, but everybody will be affected by COVID-19. So we're seeing this real broadening of the employee promise proposition in a really human way between the employer and their employee, and putting in significant supports and steps to support their staff, both from a mental and a physical health perspective. And also, some people are saying at the moment that employers' brands will rise or fall off the back of their response to COVID-19 for their workforce. And this may matter sooner than we might expect, with some organisations locally here in Ireland and further afield announcing pretty aggressive recruitment plans, in the near term. So that's one area that we're seeing a lot of. The business will be back for Signor. So that's one area that's definitely, on the agenda for a lot of organisations. Another aspect is probably what we're seeing is the vital role that internal communications has started to play. It's become probably the thread that's holding us together when we're so physically distant. It's replacing a lot of the daily interactions, that we would have had as colleagues. It's connecting us with our leaders and their vision for how we're navigating through this process. It's championing those stories that we're hearing about how organizations are, having phenomenal impacts with their staff or actually within society, which at the moment when we are physically distant, that inspiring purpose or motivating our staff about what we're involved in has become really critical. So we're talking to a lot of organizations about their comms functions. Wouldn't have been top of the priority list before, but we're saying, are you thinking about these things? Do you have your two-way feedback? Like really simple things, your two-way feedback with your staff. Are you listening? Are you adequately resourced? We've moved from chaos, and there's no let up on the horizon in terms of the demand coming for this kind of information. And finally, I would echo, sorry, go ahead, yeah.
Go for it.
No, I was just going to echo the operating model piece. So that's something that's definitely changing a lot for, like right now, for a lot of our clients. There's some real changes, whether it's government, we're working with a financial organisation at the moment, services organisation, and whether it's them trying to be ready for their customers, but also managing the mandated changes coming from government around payment breaks. They are transforming their retail proposition. So they're looking at how do they deploy their workforce? What new skills are they going to need in the future? What's the digital enablement impact of those things? So they're probably some of the things in this phase that we're seeing. And then there's obviously the bigger picture piece as well in the beyond piece.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mary Kate. You kind of lost me in saying that recruitment's on the rise. But we see companies go from just survive mode. And again, there's someone one end of the spectrum who really need to figure out how they wean themselves off a lot of that soft money, as David mentioned. But then the other end of the spectrum, we have people moving now to kind of just-in-time recruitment. So now specific roles, to service to new operating models that are evolving and they're seeing demand for in the marketplace, which is a whole range of skills that we wouldn't traditionally recruit for. So we're seeing that across several markets. And then the value proposition is is evolving in a very different way. And some of it, I think, might be short to medium term around the type of work that we value in terms of the immediate impact on frontline, for example, and then some of the longer enduring purpose of the organization that's now more attractive or certainly more relevant in the last couple of weeks is the impact on the society in which we exist. And that's beyond corporate philanthropy, beyond CSR. It's not just what you say, it's your immediate impact on those in your community. Mary Kate, thanks for joining us and thanks for that view on the ground. Stay safe.
Care.
David, just to pick up on what Mary Kate said there about operating models, what are you seeing across your client base in terms of where demand is shifting towards and how that's impacting the organizational structures and the plans of those organizations?
Yeah, I think maybe I can bring it down into like more the HR people talent space in this, because it'll maybe keep more of a focus. Is that I'll give you a few examples, Rob. We'll start maybe with some bigger things that were never possible before that now seem eminently sensible. So for the last 5 years, I've had colleagues in my team talking oftentimes to big banks about what way would they have to reorganize their operating model and their people if they wanted to have a 4-day week. You know, like you've got these concepts going on for a long time, a lot of lip service. Now we have 6 big banks at the same time, all looking at this practically and wanting to look at how they'd upskill people to do this working remotely. They're working out, some people could be 4 days a week, some could be part remote, some could never be permanently remote. Some jobs, like maybe a trader, can't be 4 days a week. They have to be 5 days because the markets are open. But others in IT and project management and other roles, we deal with customers, compliance, HR, could be very easily. They're driven, what's ignited this originally was the idea of digital transformation, virtual working, new ways of delivering service and product to customers, and lean operating models, and maybe some cost pressures. But the thing that's tipped it into real action has been that kind of first part of the arc around where they're trying to say, okay, now we have a cash conservation target and we have a crisis going on that's caused us to change how all our people are operating. And we now can look to see how do we, as we go into the next stage of operation, maybe they can give people a really good EVP. You know, like what EY were saying is that if you're able to offer a credible 4-day week or a mix of virtual and on-site working, and you're able to do that in a way that's maybe going to take out 10% of your SIB costs, but you might actually have to give back maybe 15-70% of the time to people in your organization. In general, everyone's a winner there, as long as you can deliver a model that works for customers. But then if it means, in another case though, it means you're going to have to upskill people, because you're going to have to get people to, let's say, do agile project delivery. You're going to have to get people to come up with new ways of servicing customers. You'll have to get people who are willing to learn more quickly, willing to totally adapt to new processes. So we have companies doing wealth management who like driving around in cars, and they spend all day long driving around. But now they're working. We've multiple banks where they found out, same as EY said, here at AM, we're finding out that a lot of them are more productive and they're having better conversations, and it's easier to get people than it ever has been before. And they're able to be a lot more productive. And they just would have never changed what they were doing if this didn't happen. And we can see from our own talent measurement area, I think you've seen a lot of our digital readiness and digital leadership models. You know, we're assessing around 40 million people a year for selection and development. Companies half the time had no burning platform about why this was important. They knew all about it in theory, and they'd go to conferences. But now they're going, oh, we're going like, yes, 4-day week. Oh, we'd save 15% of the headcount cost. Oh, yes, agile virtual working. Yeah, super. That means people don't have to drive around in the car. And then even simple things like, Rob, so some people think like, well, how will it affect me? Like we have a lot of, we'll say, mid and back office colleagues and our customers even, where, you know, things like getting something done on DocuSign would have involved Albert Einstein, you know, a few weeks ago. Now everybody's a DocuSign expert. And that kind of micro learning of new skills, you know, we've seen like, you know, our both our friend Mike Ferrick with Alice and the e-learning company, I think they did 600,000 new members in the last few weeks, all on learning new skills. So I can see really clearly that if you're an individual or you're an organization looking to see how you'll organize the work to deliver best economic value from productivity or cost efficiency for your customer is going to be a winner for you, whether you do it yourself or you do it as a talent practitioner with your staff, or you're involved in the strategy and ops side of business. It's really blindingly obvious. And it's in the old never waste a crisis mode that things that took a decade to get sorted out 3 months ago are now taking 10 days to sort out. And I've never seen more products and services built so quick that should have been built anyway.
And if we look beyond not wasting a good crisis, David, and look not to waste a good recovery, is there anything you think we've missed through not being in the workplace? Like, what's the one thing that will affect us in the long term if we maintain this kind of hyper flexibility or complete dislocation of the workforce?
Yeah, I think that I've seen colleagues running a lot of projects at the moment where it's kind of connected into the we've a health and well-being practice and also this talent measurement practice. There's a lot of companies trying to look at which type of workers are normally disposed towards working virtually and autonomously, or which ones like to be in teams and which way they like to work. I think there'll be a lot of investigation goes into that around, again, EVP, about people having preferences for working in certain ways. And that won't be just like I have loads of children, or I have to mind the dog, or I live a long way from work, or whatever it is. It'll be about like, do they like or not like, and are they more productive in that way? There'll be a lot more analytics in that space. We've a lot of projects going on looking at that. But what I do think is very evident, and I've seen it in so many talent, like early stage talent development projects, with graduates and people coming in from campus. A key part that cohort endlessly says is important is the social aspect of work. And a lot of the career development they get comes from kind of on the job, but not necessarily the job. It's the participation with others formally and informally. And I do think that I've seen our clients who say do a lot now about setting up development centers, even one setting up virtual internships. We've seen a lot of the internships like Citigroup, Morgan Stanley. I think EY is actually doing it. If her colleague was on there, they're not cancelling their internship, but they're having it virtually, and they're all looking for ways to create the social environment as well as the work environment. I really think the companies need to be conscious of, especially the people who are early into the workforce, that they really need the social participation, because the learning curve for them is so steep and they won't get a second chance at that. And I think if you want highly productive people early in their careers, I think having them physically able to congregate, come together, commune, is going to be really important. And it won't be a great idea to leave them just virtualized and remote. I think their way of how they perceive value in work and enjoyment is heavily predicated on, as well, on physically convening. And I don't have evidence for that, from this current, recovery and crisis, but I would assume that to be the case based on all of the type of data we pick up around engagement and EVP from previous projects.
For sure. And I think what happens between our people and the connections that are formed and that friendship ultimately that blossoms amongst colleagues, it means a lot, and it runs deep with people, and it ties in massively, I think, to drive discretionary effort that we fight harder for one another.
And Robin, I was talking to my wife at the kitchen table today, and in the first job I had when I left college, I spent 80% of my time talking about the people I knew in that job, what I did in that job, and I met her there, at that. But I realized it was only there for less than 3 years, but it dominated 80% of my whole thinking about what was work and my whole time. Well, that wasn't the way it happened, Rob. It was, I did her induction, and then she spent 3 hours telling me what to do.
Ian, we'll move on.
Yes.
Thanks, David. Mary Kate mentioned earlier on around some of the well-being consideration as we look to reconvene. And it's clear to me that although we've been through a collective trauma, that the personal experience is individual. And quite often I hear people talk about the silver lining of this, that we get time with family, and there's some great benefits. I'm conscious we view this through the lens of being privileged. And there are those who have much a tougher time in the last while, and just to consider that spectrum. Do you have any views on how we can create greater unity, or use this common experience to create that unity as opposed to division?
Yeah, and I think that I was interested in some of the things that David was talking about there, because it's very interesting to hear what's happening structurally, in terms of business models and reinvention and so on. And then you've finished off by talking about, you asked the question, what might be missing and what might be lacking. You talked about the kind of social connection. And, as well as structure, what in the middle term is culture going to look like whenever we're in a situation where it's disrupted and we're not in the normal of office life? And when I talk about culture, central to what is going to be necessary, we're getting the sense of, and this isn't new news, is the ability to build and maintain trust. How do you do that? Because it's far easier to build and maintain trust when you're in near proximity to people than when you're at a distance, right? And we had a situation where, if you look at currently what people are going through, so the three most basic human fears that we have are the fear of extinction, the fear of isolation, and the fear of loss of control. Now, we have created a situation that we're right in the middle of now, which ticks all of those three boxes. You've got a triplicate. So we've got an epidemic, and as well as that, we've got an infodemic. So people are walking around and they're overwhelmed. And you can see that some people are responding really, really well to it. Like, I look at my two kids. I'm seeing sides of my two kids that I've never seen. And they're only fractionally affected by this. Look at your neighbors. There are some neighbors that I'm going to be a lot closer to when this is all over. And there are a few that I probably won't be going around for Christmas lunch. And I guess that's true for all of us. And the human truth of it is that these moments are the moments that are going to define relationships as we go forward, because how we show up in these moments is going to define the relationship. And, if you look at the brain, in 2009, we had a situation, and I'm reminded of it starkly because it illustrates this very well. One of our clients was a major financial institution, and it went from being a financial institution with about 1,700 employees overnight to having to turn itself into a collections institution with half of the staff. Now, if you think about that from a structural point of view, that's got its own issues. If you think of it from a cultural point of view, and the hallmark of that for us was, we realized that the leaders who had best maintained and showed up in a particular way positively were the ones who were able to reboot and restart and move forward very, very quickly. But there was as much bad behavior as there was good behavior, and that was what held the culture back. And the idea was, how do we rebuild a culture based on trust? And interestingly, when people are exposed in the way we're currently exposed, and the fight or flight brain comes out, what it does is it actually makes you stupid, intellectually stupid, because it narrows your focus and it shortens your horizon. So rationale goes out the window and emotion takes over, which is why you have people fighting over toilet rolls in shopping aisles. It has no rationale, but in the moment, that's at risk, that's at issue, people are tetchy, and this is what happens. The counter side to this, and this is the opportunity for leaders and leadership, is that trust, real trust, is built only in these moments. So it's only when you're at that point, we call them the 5% moments because they're the minority of the time, but there are more frequent and deeper 5% moments that occur. And if a leader is able to step into that and help people, and also show up in a way during their own tensions and reactions, which are natural and human, it's going to be the flashpoint around which trust is built. And that's the foundation stone of culture and future culture, particularly when people are working remotely. And what I'm interested in, so people are going to judge you based on how you show up or don't show up in their 5% moments and in your 5% moments, fairly or unfairly, because it's a very, very difficult thing to do. How do you remain calm in a moment when you don't feel calm yourself? But you need to do that for your people. How do you become clear and give clarity and be very succinct and unambiguous at a time whenever there's ambiguity all around you by yourself? So the help that leadership are going to need, and I know that we're talking to an audience here of HR professionals who are the custodians of culture, actually, because if it's not you, then who's looking after the culture of your organization? And CPO is no longer chief people officer, it's culture preservation officer. And the way in which we're able to support and help our leaders who are out there in the trenches in their 5% moments being judged by how they're showing up, because that's going to determine the future culture in the near term and the long term of the organization.
That new CPO definition, let me come back to that in 1 second. I like that, Ian. Two things you mentioned. Building trust through relationships. And David mentioned the challenge for new, younger cohorts being onboarded and what that means in a virtual setting. To try and kind of just marry both of those. So we've recently had a colleague join our team, a new director, in fact, Mike. He came from a competitor. And I've been amazed at how he's formed relationships so quickly. On one level. On another level, I'm not surprised. And there's two sides to trust, in my view, Ian. So one is being trustworthy, and the other side is given some vulnerability. And for both parties to assume positive intent is a very powerful force. And I've seen that play out in our own organization in recent weeks. And I've seen how strong the relationships that have been built over such a short term virtually, I've been really impressed and very surprised by. I want to bring back to your CPO point. I like that. So if we're talking about culture and custodians of culture, and if we're talking about it being something organic, something that lives and breathes, and ultimately is the collective output of behavior, that changes and it shifts and depends on dynamic, context, and who's present. The guiding principle and the North Star for culture is and has always been purpose. So your why, or what you stand for. I see a question come through here from Joe Feely. Hi, Joe. Hope you're well. Joe says, for the last 12, 18 months, she's been working with a lot of clients around the world on HR digital transformation and reorganize themselves around purpose. And our question is, do you think there's an opportunity now for us to look to repurpose what we stand for as organizations, and what can leadership do about that? David, I might come to you, if I may.
I think that it's right that companies will be judged on how they act during the pandemic, about the way they treated their customers, the way they treated their employees. I do think there's a huge part to play for people involved in people, culture, HR, around how they'll reshape the way behavior and cognitive and intellectual attributes are valued in how people operate in virtual, remote, agile, digital ways. And there's a great prize to be there to position ourselves in that space if we're coming from that area of the business. Although I do think that really what's really happening is just a rapid acceleration of then what was a lot of the existing ambitions of the companies that had the intent, and the worst nightmare has come true for some of the ones that were hoping the future would get slightly delayed. And it does smell a bit like the newspapers and the internet type situation. And the newspapers would have had the wherewithal to have made the changes, if they'd been willing to. And maybe they were given too much time. So maybe companies if you work for the equivalent of a newspaper now and you're in human resources or talent, you have a great chance to get in at the front row here about how to reorganize people or have an impact on what they'll do to deliver a new model, because it'll have to happen so fast that it's going to involve identifying how to upskill, deploy people, organize them. And this kind of telescope period, I think, gives an opportunity. I don't think it changes things, beyond recognition. I just think it's accelerated everything so enormously. And I guess one other thing, Rob, as well, is that I do think, I was talking to a lot of people in workforce development around the world. They're mainly dealing with retraining people, upskilling, and getting people back into employment. I think in Ireland alone, we're going to have 180,000 people who are going to be added into the environment, where they're not in a job, and they're going to be working with Intrio and Solace and education and training boards. And that I hope that we'll have learned a lot from the last recession, 2008, that all those people were nearly back into work. and all productive and skilled and capable and doing great stuff, 3-6 months ago, a lot of them are going to lose their jobs again. But I hope that this time people can very rapidly see that given the right skills and engaging with that group in the right way, that there's so much talent that's going to be available. And again, if you're a people officer, talent, you should have your lasso on, and your horse and be out there finding the best people, because you're not going to be able to do it without people.
And it's interesting, the dislocation of that workforce you speak about, David, isn't a performance management question. It's more of a kind of a cost or a swerve in terms of strategy and a necessity.
She even saw Airbnb set up a kind of a reverse job site. I can't remember what it's called, but if somebody's an Airbnb career site or something, they'll see that for people who gave permission, the Airbnb colleagues can make themselves into public profiles, and they're kind of on a public thing. If you want to find them, you can look and see what skills they have and engage with them. Like, can you imagine 3 or 4 months ago, the likes of a West Coast Californian tech company allowing its software engineers to put their profile up online to indicate that they might be available for employment somewhere else? But that's good behavior, because that company is trying to survive. It's adopting its business model. It's kind of narrowed its focus, we can see again, into the homes area as opposed to other things it was going into. And it's very quickly trying to do the right thing by people who are messed up. A couple of thousand people, there's no work for them at the moment. But I suppose that's the kind of, and that was a people officer / technology with people person must have worked out how to do that. It's brilliant.
Yeah, no, excellent. Just conscious of time, guys, as well. And we've got 985 people on here as well. There's a lot of questions coming through. So we'll try and move through a couple of those questions. Ian, I'll come to you, if I may. The need for us to remain the best version of ourselves as leaders. What can we do to maintain or to sustain our ability to impact as best we can as we look to permanently reinvent over the coming months and years?
I think if there's one thing that we all know, and it's only being reinforced through this session, is this is going to last indefinitely. Whatever this is, and however chaotic it's going to be, and the different iterations of it. So to use a cliche, it's a marathon. And if you're setting yourself up for a marathon, if I look at some of our clients and some of our leaders for the last 8 weeks, they've been working 14-hour days consistently all the way through in very difficult and trying circumstances, where their own limbic system is triggering, and they're trying to hold it together for other people from one end of the day to the next, and for family, and maybe they've got aging relatives. And many people just report that they come home at the end of the day, and when I say home, they're already home. So this is virtual, and they just shut off whenever that is, and they either break down into tears or they reach for the gin bottle, or both, because it's really, really tough. Because the buck stops with you as a leader. Ultimately, people are looking to you. You're the life support system for them in every sense. So unless you're able to cater and look after yourself, so there's basically 3 things that we advocate that you need to do. The first thing is the antidote to chaos is order. And even though it's a really simple thing, creating systems and routines for yourself is a critical ingredient, because this need that we have to create some form of understanding and meaning, at least routine gives us meaning. And I'm talking about routining things that are critically important, like sleep, getting enough sleep, getting adequate exercise, getting a diet that's well balanced, not too many of the blueberry muffins, although a treat now and again is pretty good. So that's on one side of it. The second thing is having a schedule, knowing what you're doing from day to day, week to week, and probably not even much more beyond a week, because who can tell beyond a week? But if you know what your schedule is for a week and for a day, so that you actually have something that you're focused on, you know exactly what you're doing and what the routine is for that. And the third thing, which is like, it's very fundamental, but you'd be surprised at how few people have it. Because we're chaotic, we tend to hold a lot of things, probably more than we normally would, in our heads, because we're away from our offices and we're away from where we typically store things. So we tend to store them in our heads. This is going to deplete your mental energy faster than anything else, because there's an effect which is called the Zeigarnik Effect, which means that if you just take something that's in your head and you've got somewhere to record it and you put it down, it feels like it's completed, even if you haven't done it. And nothing depletes mental energy more than feeling that something is unfinished. So by simply having a routine, a balance, and within the balance of family, balance of time for your work, balance of time for your people internally, balance of time for your clients, balance of time for yourself and your significant other, and also a balance of time for yourself and your own nourishments. So the sort of things that you get deprived of by being at home all the time is often the things that are most nourishing to you personally in your personal space. That's the first thing, is routining. The second thing is, in the same way as you're busy emptying other people's emotional cup and helping them, somebody needs to be doing the same for you. And you referred to it at the very start. You obviously listened to the podcast. If you create your own war cabinet, so imagine that this is it. It would be like a boardroom of directors in peacetime, a personal board of directors. But who's your phone a friend? Who are the people that you trust? Who are the people you can rely on? The people who give you the sage words and the sage wisdom. Who are the people who can cater for you in all dimensions that you now need it? And it can be financial, it can be emotional, it can be spiritual, it can be physical. So whatever who are those people? And have a routine of connection to them so that you speak to them regularly, because that's going to help you empty your own cup. It's about putting your own oxygen mask on first, which is typically what gets forgotten. And the third thing that I'd say as a final thing is that this really is a time to be kind to yourself. All of us have that inner critic that sits there on our shoulder all the time. This is the time to furlough the inner critic, give it the moratorium, send it off for the next 3 months or until the end of October, like the Brits, and dispense with it. Because, about 10% of the work that we do is executive coaching and one-to-one coaching. And you would be amazed at how many very, very successful people are crippled by imposter syndrome. Even and especially the very successful people. They believe that at any moment they're going to get found out, that they're not worthy, that they're not good enough. And in times of chaos like this, that gets accelerated or accentuated, is that sense of self-doubt. This is not time for perfectionists. So perfectionists out there, I really do feel sorry for you. It's very difficult. This is the time for good enough. This is the time for the MVP. You talk, David, about iteration and reiteration and trial and error. Great things are going to come out of this. We'll talk about opportunity in a second. And it's time to give yourself a break and allow yourself a bit of kindness, personal kindness for yourself.
To try new things or to experiment, Ian, is what we do when we don't know what to do. I think you taught me that. A question here, Ian. What's next door to the chaos room?
Oh, the next room you'll be glad to hear is the inspiration room. And David's already started to talk about some of the things that are happening, because it is impossible. If you think about the situation we're in now, you have a situation where you've got forced reflection time. Never in the history of our working lives have people been forced to stay at home. None of us. Nobody we know. So forced reflection time, you can't not reflect, and an uncertain future. When you add those two things together, you only get one thing, and it's innovation. And I came across this interesting statistic. There was a very similar outbreak. The Black Death happened in the middle of the 17th century. And one of the consequences of that, Cambridge University had to close down. And one of the deans at the time, or one of the professors at the time, was one Isaac Newton. He was sent home, sat in his garden, apple fell on his head. Lo and behold, hey presto, we got the law of gravity. So that came out as something like this. So if we can invent the law of gravity 400 years ago out of this, then, we've got a chance of inventing something great out of it here too.
Lovely. That's a great final thought, Ian. Thanks for that. David, I'll come to you. As we look towards full-scale new ways of working, what we've lost and what we need to protect from what we've gained in recent weeks, what would you advise the 986 HR leaders on here to do tomorrow to prepare for the order?
Well, what I would think, that, and again, links a bit to what Ian said, is that every opportunity you get involved with the people on the front line. You can see I saw a survey in Fast Company there before lunch. All the leaders who are up at the top of the list at the moment, the likes of John Donoghue from Nike, are all ones who got actively involved in the frontline operation side of their business during this, delivering value to colleagues on the front line and customers at levels they wouldn't normally have interacted. I think Jeff Bezos actually fell down the rankings quite a lot because he has not been as involved as maybe he should have been. Maybe he's making out like Jesse James, but his ranking as a leader, in the bigger picture, is not improving. Whereas the Nike guy operated, and Michael Dell, very on the front line. So I would advise all those leaders or professional expert jobs, go help the people, get involved. It'll make you credible, authentic, and valued and appreciated, and people will trust you. And I would say that I've always been one to use this quote that I've had for like decades, and there's not always a chance to do it, but there's a quote that goes something like, think like a person of action and act like a person of thought. And there has never been a better time for being a kind of an activist who's empathetic, because you're not going to get in very much trouble at the moment for trying to do things to get outcomes, as long as you're good-spirited and kind to the people you're dealing with. Be human and be active.
Lovely. I'm thinking for an inspirational quote to finish, but I'm just thinking of rap songs, so I don't think it's very appropriate.
Eminem,
Jen,
I know some Eminem lyrics.
We leave it there, guys. Guys, thank you so much for your insights and taking the time to join us. And I wish you, yours, and your teams best of luck and good health in the interim. Thank you all for joining back in your home offices, I assume. I hope you found this useful. We've had some feedback, and probably one thing that was been missing from this series is your involvement and your collaboration. It's what I miss most now that we can't convene. So it was suggested to us that we look to host virtual roundtables where we get your participation and your input to share thoughts, ideas, and practical takeaways as we look to get this recovery underway. So if you're interested in participating in one of those, please type Y in the comments box on the right, and we can look to deal with some of the questions that were surfaced today, and then to host those roundtables over the coming days. Last week we did False Start with Margaret Heffernan, as some of you may know. So we have her scheduled. We're back in business. She's going to go live at 3:15 p.m. next Tuesday, the 19th. Her book, Uncharted, is a must-read. And the concluding line, in fact, it says, it doesn't matter where we start, only what we do. Last week, we got off to a false start, and now we're looking to rerun this and get to do it again next Tuesday, the 19th at 3:15. David, Ian, thank you so much for your participation and your contribution. Thank you all for joining us at home, and I hope this goes some way to enhance the working lives of your people. Until next Tuesday, speak then. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.